Sarah Martinez had been waiting at the bus stop for nearly 2 hours, watching the snow fall harder with each passing minute. The weather forecast had predicted light flurries, but nature had other plans. What started as gentle snowflakes had transformed into a relentless blizzard that was quickly covering the streets of downtown Minneapolis in a thick white blanket. She adjusted her crutches and shifted her weight, trying to find a more comfortable position against the bus shelter's thin metal wall. The prosthetic leg she wore felt heavier than usual in the cold, and the socket where it connected to her residual limb was beginning to chafe. Sarah had lost her left leg below the knee 3 years ago in a motorcycle accident, and while she had adapted remarkably well to her new reality, days like this reminded her of the additional challenges she faced. The digital display at the bus stop flickered erratically before going completely dark. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the transit app, but the screen showed what she had feared: service suspended due to severe weather conditions. Her heart sank as she realized she was stranded 15 miles from her apartment with no way to get home. Other commuters began to disperse, some calling for rides, others walking to nearby buildings for shelter. Sarah watched as a businessman in an expensive coat climbed into a waiting taxi, followed by a group of college students who piled into an Uber. She had tried calling for a rideshare herself, but the app showed no available drivers in the area. The surge pricing was astronomical, and even if she could afford it, there were simply no cars willing to venture out in these conditions. As the crowd thinned, Sarah found herself increasingly alone. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally across the street and making visibility nearly impossible. She pulled her winter coat tighter around herself and considered her options. The nearest building was a closed coffee shop about half a block away, but even that short distance seemed daunting on crutches in these conditions. She had been standing there, trying to gather the courage to make the trek, when she heard the rumble of a large engine approaching. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the headlights of what appeared to be a pickup truck moving slowly down the street. As it got closer, she could see it was actually a modified military-style vehicle, painted in dark green with oversized tires that seemed to handle the snow with ease. The vehicle pulled up to the curb near the bus stop, and Sarah could hear the engine idling powerfully. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in his mid-30s with short-cropped hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was wearing what looked like military-issued winter gear, and there was something about his posture and alertness that immediately suggested he was or had been in the armed forces. "Ma'am, you've been standing here for quite a while," the man called out over the wind. His voice was calm but carried an authority that made people listen. "This storm is getting worse and it's not safe to be out here. Do you need a ride somewhere?" Sarah hesitated for a moment. Her mother had always warned her about accepting rides from strangers, but she had also taught her to trust her instincts about people. Something about this man's demeanor suggested he was genuinely concerned for her safety rather than harboring any ill intentions. Still, the practical part of her brain couldn't help but notice how isolated she was becoming as the last few people around the bus stop hurried away to find shelter. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah called back, raising her voice to be heard over the wind, "but I don't want to impose. I'm sure someone will be able to pick me up soon." Even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Her sister lived across the country, her parents were both at work and didn't drive in snow, and her close friends were either out of town or didn't own vehicles capable of handling these conditions. The man studied her for a moment, and she could see him taking note of her crutches and the way she was favoring one leg. "Ma'am, with respect, I've been watching the traffic reports, and emergency services are advising everyone to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. The plows can't keep up with this snowfall rate, and several roads have already been closed. If you're waiting for someone to pick you up, they might not be able to get through." As if to emphasize his point, a car attempted to navigate the intersection nearby, only to slide sideways and end up stuck against a snowbank. The driver got out, looked around helplessly, and then began walking away, apparently abandoning the vehicle until the storm passed. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was beginning to realize just how precarious her situation was becoming. The snow was now falling so heavily that she could barely see across the street, and the wind was creating drifts that were already several feet high in some areas. Her fingers were starting to go numb despite her gloves, and she could feel the cold seeping through her boots. "Where are you trying to get to?" the man asked, keeping his engine running but showing no signs of impatience despite the worsening conditions. "The Riverside Apartments on 34th Street," Sarah replied, mentioning the complex where she had lived since her accident. It was chosen specifically because it was accessible and close to public transportation, but right now those advantages seemed meaningless. The man nodded. That's not too far from where I'm headed. I know those apartments, they're good units, well maintained. I'm Marcus Thompson, by the way. I just finished a training exercise with some local emergency response teams, which is why I'm out in this weather with a vehicle that can actually handle it. Sarah appreciated that he had offered his name and an explanation for why he was driving around in such dangerous conditions. It helped ease some of her concerns about his motives. I'm Sarah Martinez. I work at the downtown library, and I was just trying to get home from my shift when the storm got worse than expected. Libraries are important, Marcus said with what sounded like genuine respect. My daughter loves our local library back in Virginia. Listen, Sarah, I know you don't know me from anyone, but I've got winter survival training, a vehicle designed for this kind of weather, and a strong desire to make sure nobody gets stuck out in this storm. I'm not going to pressure you, but the offer stands if you want to get somewhere warm and safe. Sarah looked around at the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The bus shelter was providing minimal protection from the wind, and snow was beginning to accumulate even in the supposedly sheltered area where she stood. Her phone showed that the temperature was dropping steadily, and the wind chill was making it feel even colder. She realized that staying put was becoming genuinely dangerous, while getting into the vehicle with Marcus was merely uncertain. I appreciate your offer, she said, making her decision. I have to admit I'm running out of good options here, but I should mention that I have some mobility challenges. I use crutches and have a prosthetic leg. It might take me a minute to get situated in your truck. Marcus immediately shifted the vehicle into park and opened his door. No problem at all. Let me help you get in safely. The truck sits up pretty high, but there are running boards and handles. We'll take whatever time you need. As Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, Sarah got her first good look at him. He was tall and solidly built, with the kind of fitness that came from serious physical training rather than casual gym visits. His movements were economical and purposeful, and the way he automatically scanned the surrounding area suggested habits developed through military service. Despite his obvious physical capabilities, there was something gentle in his approach as he walked around to her side of the truck. The passenger door has a good step and a sturdy handle, he said, opening the door and gesturing to show her the features. Take your time and let me know if you need any assistance. I've got a clean towel in here to wipe the snow off your crutches before we store them. Sarah felt a wave of relief as she realized that Marcus had immediately understood her needs without making her feel like a burden or an object of pity. In her experience, people often reacted to her disability in one of two ways. Either they ignored it completely and became frustrated when she needed accommodations, or they became overly solicitous in a way that made her feel helpless. Marcus seemed to have struck the right balance, acknowledging her needs while treating her as a capable adult who could direct her own care. The wind gusted particularly strongly, nearly knocking Sarah off balance despite her crutches. Marcus stepped closer, positioning himself to block some of the wind while remaining ready to steady her if needed. This storm is really picking up, he observed. The weather service was calling for 6 inches, but this looks like it could be a lot more than that. Sarah managed to make her way to the passenger door, grateful for the vehicle's design features that Marcus had pointed out. The running board was wide and had a non-slip surface, and the handle was positioned perfectly for someone who needed to transfer weight from crutches to the vehicle. As she settled into the passenger seat, she noticed that the interior was immaculately clean and organized, with emergency supplies visible in the back seat. Are you comfortable? Marcus asked as he helped her arrange her crutches in the back where they would be secure but easily accessible. The heat should help warm you up quickly. I've got the seat warmers on too, if that's helpful. This feels amazing, Sarah admitted as the warmth began to penetrate her cold-numbed extremities. I hadn't realized how cold I was getting until I got in here. Thank you so much for stopping. I think I was in more trouble than I wanted to admit to myself. Marcus climbed back into the driver's seat and put the vehicle in gear, checking his mirrors carefully before pulling away from the curb. Sometimes we don't realize how bad a situation is until we're out of it. That's actually something they teach in survival training, the danger of normalizing gradually worsening conditions. You were smart to accept help when it was offered. As they began to navigate the snow-covered streets, Sarah found herself studying her rescuer more closely. There was definitely something military in his bearing, but he also had a thoughtfulness that suggested education and life experience beyond just service training. The way he drove was confident but extremely cautious, clearly adapted for the hazardous conditions they were facing. "Have you been in Minneapolis long?" Sarah asked, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly because conversation helped ease the slight awkwardness of being in a vehicle with a complete stranger. "Just a couple of weeks," Marcus replied, keeping his eyes focused on the road as he navigated around an abandoned car. "I'm actually transitioning out of active duty Navy and considering settling in this area. I've been doing some consulting work with local emergency services, helping them adapt some military protocols for civilian disaster response. It's interesting work, and the people here seem genuine and hardworking." "Navy?" Sarah asked with interest. "My grandfather was Navy. He used to tell stories about his service, though most of them were probably cleaned up for civilian consumption." Marcus chuckled. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. Yeah, I was a Navy SEAL for 12 years. Did 4 deployments, worked with some amazing people, and learned skills I never thought I'd need. But now I'm looking for ways to use that training to help people here at home instead of overseas." Sarah felt a mixture of respect and slight intimidation. She had never met a Navy SEAL before, though she had certainly heard enough stories and seen enough movies to have some idea of the level of training and dedication involved. It explained his calm competence in the current situation, as well as the way he seemed to be constantly aware of his surroundings while still maintaining a conversation. "That's quite a career change," she observed. "What made you decide to transition to civilian work?" "A lot of factors," Marcus said thoughtfully as he carefully maneuvered around a city plow that was struggling to keep up with the snowfall. "I've had an incredible career in the Navy, and I'm proud of my service. But I'm 34 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life in environments where I couldn't really put down roots or build the kind of community connections that I'm starting to value more. I want to use my skills to help people, but I also want to be able to go home to the same place every night and maybe eventually have a family." There was something refreshingly honest about his answer that made Sarah feel more at ease. "That makes sense. It must be a big adjustment, though, going from military life to civilian life." "It definitely is," Marcus agreed. "Everything from the pace of life to the way decisions get made is different, but I'm lucky to have some savings and the flexibility to take my time finding the right fit. The consulting work has been good for that. It lets me stay connected to the skills I've developed while I figure out what comes next." As they continued through the storm, Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by Marcus's driving abilities. The roads were becoming increasingly treacherous, with several cars visible in ditches or stuck against snow barriers. Emergency vehicles were having trouble navigating the conditions, and she could see that normal traffic had essentially come to a standstill. Yet Marcus managed to keep them moving steadily toward her apartment complex, choosing routes that avoided the worst of the accumulated snow while maintaining enough speed to prevent getting stuck themselves. "You're really good at this," Sarah commented, as Marcus expertly guided them around a particularly challenging intersection where multiple vehicles had become stuck. "I've lived in Minnesota my whole life, and I don't think I've ever seen someone handle snow driving like this." "Military training includes a lot of different environments," Marcus explained. "We did cold weather operations in Alaska, mountain training in Colorado, and I've driven everything from small reconnaissance vehicles to armored personnel carriers in conditions ranging from desert sand to Arctic ice. Snow is definitely challenging, but it's not unpredictable once you understand the physics involved." "The physics involved?" Sarah asked with amusement. "You make it sound like a science experiment." "In a way it is," Marcus said with a grin that was the first really relaxed expression she had seen from him. "Traction coefficients, weight distribution, momentum management. It's all about understanding how the vehicle interacts with the surface conditions and adjusting your inputs accordingly. Most civilian drivers have never had to think about that stuff because normal conditions are forgiving enough that you can get away with suboptimal technique." Sarah found his analytical approach to driving strangely reassuring. There was something comforting about being with someone who approached challenges systematically rather than just hopping for the best. It made her feel like they were less at the mercy of the storm and more in control of their own fate. 20 minutes into their journey, what had started as a straightforward rescue was beginning to reveal itself as something much more complex. Marcus had been navigating the increasingly dangerous roads with impressive skill, but even his advanced driving abilities were being tested by the rapidly worsening conditions. The snow was now falling so heavily that the windshield wipers could barely keep up, and visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet in any direction. "The main route to your apartment complex is completely blocked," Marcus said, studying the GPS display that showed multiple road closures ahead. "There's been a multi-car accident on Highway 35, and they've shut down that entire section. I'm going to have to take us through some residential areas to get around it." Sarah looked out at the white wall of snow surrounding them and felt a growing sense of unease. What should have been a 15-minute drive was turning into something much longer and more complicated. "I'm sorry I've put you in this position," she said. "If you need to just drop me off somewhere safe and warm, I can figure out another way to get home once the storm passes." "Absolutely not," Marcus replied with a kind of firm conviction that brooked no argument. "I don't leave people behind, and I definitely don't abandon someone in a situation like this. We're going to get you home safely, even if it takes a little longer than we planned." As they turned onto a smaller residential street, hopping to find a route that would eventually connect them back to Sarah's neighborhood, Marcus suddenly hit the brakes. Through the swirling snow, they could make out the silhouette of another vehicle that had slid off the road and was now tilted at an alarming angle in the ditch. The hazard lights were flashing, indicating that someone was still inside. "We need to check on them," Marcus said, already putting his vehicle in park. "That car looks like it could tip over completely if the wind gets much stronger." Sarah watched as Marcus grabbed a powerful flashlight from the center console and stepped back out into the storm. His movements were quick and efficient, and she could see him fighting against the wind as he made his way toward the stranded vehicle. Even through the heavy snowfall, she could tell that he was moving with purpose, approaching the car from an angle that would allow him to assess the situation before making contact with whoever was inside. Within minutes, Marcus was back at their truck, this time accompanied by an elderly man who was moving slowly and appeared to be having difficulty with the conditions. "Sarah, this is Mr. Peterson," Marcus called out as he helped the older man toward their vehicle. "His car went off the road about 10 minutes ago, and he's been trying to call for help, but his cell phone isn't getting a signal out here." Mr. Peterson was probably in his 70s, with sparse white hair that was now covered in snow and glasses that kept fogging up in the temperature changes. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or shock was difficult to determine. "I'm so sorry to be a bother," he said in a voice that carried the distinct accent of someone who had lived in Minnesota for many decades. "I was trying to get home to my wife. She'll be worried sick if I don't show up soon." "You're not a bother at all," Sarah assured him as Marcus helped him into the back seat of the truck. "We're all just trying to get through this storm safely." Marcus climbed back into the driver's seat and immediately adjusted the heat settings to help warm their new passenger. "Mr. Peterson, where were you trying to get to? Maybe we can get you there as part of our route." "I live in the Brookdale area just off of Penn Avenue," Mr. Peterson replied, his voice still shaky. "My wife has dementia, and she gets very confused when I'm not home at my usual time. Our daughter usually checks on her in the evenings, but she lives in St. Paul and probably can't get through in this weather either." Sarah felt her heart go out to the older man. She could hear the genuine worry in his voice, and she understood the weight of responsibility he felt toward his wife. "We'll figure out a way to get you home," she said with more confidence than she felt. Marcus was already studying his GPS and radio reports, trying to calculate the best route that would accommodate all of their destinations. "Brookdale is actually closer than Sarah's apartment," he said. "We can get you home first, Mr. Peterson, and then continue on from there." As they set off again, now with 3 passengers instead of 1, Sarah found herself observing the dynamics that were developing in their small group. Marcus had immediately taken charge of the situation without being asked, but in a way that felt natural rather than domineering. Mr. Peterson was clearly grateful but also apologetic about the additional burden he represented, and Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar position of being both a rescue recipient and part of a rescue team. "Have you lived in Minneapolis long, Mr. Peterson?" Sarah asked, trying to help the older man stay calm and engaged during what was clearly a stressful experience for him. "Oh, my whole life," Mr. Peterson replied, seeming to gather himself a bit as he talked. "Born and raised here. My wife and I bought our house in 1978, raised 3 children there. Never thought I'd see a storm quite like this one, though." The snow is coming down harder than anything I remember from the blizzard of '91. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror with interest. You've been through some serious storms over the years. What's your assessment of this one? Well, I'm no meteorologist, Mr. Peterson said with a slight chuckle, but I've been watching Minnesota weather for 73 years, and this feels different. The wind patterns aren't behaving like a normal snow system. Usually these storms have more of a rhythm to them. The snow comes down hard, then lighter, then hard again. This just keeps getting more intense. As if to confirm his observation, a particularly strong gust of wind rocked their vehicle, and Marcus had to make a slight correction to keep them centered in what he hoped was still the roadway. The snow was now so deep that it was becoming difficult to distinguish the road from the surrounding landscape, and even the residential street signs were becoming obscured. The GPS shows we're getting close to Penn Avenue, Marcus announced, though Sarah could tell from his tone that he was having to rely heavily on the navigation system since visual landmarks were essentially non-existent. Mr. Peterson, do you remember any specific features near your house that might help us identify it in these conditions? There's a large blue spruce tree in our front yard, Mr. Peterson said, pressing his face to the window in an attempt to see through the snow. And we have a lamp post at the end of our driveway, but I'm not sure how much of that will be visible right now. They spent the next several minutes creeping slowly down what they hoped was Penn Avenue, with Marcus maintaining just enough speed to prevent getting stuck, while Mr. Peterson tried to identify familiar landmarks. The storm seemed to be intensifying even further, and Sarah noticed that the radio was now broadcasting emergency warnings, advising all residents to stay indoors and avoid any unnecessary travel. I think that might be our tree, Mr. Peterson said suddenly, pointing to a large, dark shape that was barely visible through the snow. Yes, I can see the lamp post now. That's our driveway. Marcus carefully maneuvered the truck as close to the driveway as possible, but even with his vehicle's capabilities, the snow was now deep enough that getting much closer would risk getting stuck. I'm going to walk with you to the door, Mr. Peterson, he said. The snow is deep enough that it could be dangerous to try to navigate alone, especially if there are any obstacles hidden underneath. Oh, you don't need to do that, Mr. Peterson protested. You've already done so much, and I don't want to keep you out in this weather any longer than necessary. I insist, Marcus said firmly but kindly. Besides, I want to make sure your wife knows you're home safely. She's probably been worried about you. Sarah watched as Marcus helped Mr. Peterson out of the truck and then supported him as they made their way slowly toward the house. The wind was so strong that she could see both men leaning into it, and the snow was deep enough that each step required significant effort. She found herself holding her breath as they disappeared into the white swirl, hoping that they would be able to find the house and get Mr. Peterson safely inside. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, Sarah saw a light come on in what she assumed was the Peterson house, and she felt a wave of relief. A few minutes later, she could make out Marcus's figure making his way back toward the truck, moving with the same careful determination he had shown throughout the evening. Mr. Peterson is safe and warm, Marcus reported as he climbed back into the driver's seat, shaking snow off his jacket. His wife was indeed worried about him, but she's fine. Their power is still on, and they have plenty of food and supplies. I gave him my phone number in case they need any help over the next few days. That was really kind of you, Sarah said, genuinely moved by the care Marcus had shown for a complete stranger. Most people would have just dropped him off at the curb. Most people aren't trained to think about mission completion, Marcus replied with a slight smile. In the military, you don't just get someone to the general area of safety, you make sure they're actually safe. Otherwise, what was the point of the rescue? As they pulled away from the Peterson house and began making their way towards Sarah's apartment complex, she found herself reflecting on the evening's events. What had started as a simple ride home had turned into something much more significant. She had witnessed Marcus's character under pressure, seen how he responded to unexpected challenges and additional responsibilities. There was something impressive about his calm competence, his willingness to take on extra burdens without complaint, and his systematic approach to solving problems. Tell me about your work at the library, Marcus said as they navigated another challenging section of road. I imagine it's quite different from emergency response consulting. Sarah was surprised by the question, partly because it suggested that Marcus was genuinely interested in her life, rather than just focused on completing the task of getting her home. "I'm actually the head of accessibility services," she said. "I work with patrons who have various disabilities, helping them access library resources and services. It's rewarding work, though it can be challenging when we're trying to implement new accommodations on a limited budget." "That sounds like important work," Marcus said with what seemed like genuine interest. "What got you into that field?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure how much personal information she wanted to share with someone she had just met. But something about the evening's circumstances and Marcus's straightforward manner made her feel comfortable being honest. "Actually, my disability led me to it," she said. "After my accident and recovery, I realized how many barriers exist for people with disabilities trying to access services that most people take for granted. Libraries should be welcoming spaces for everyone, but that doesn't always happen automatically." "Your accident?" Marcus asked gently, showing that he had noticed her mention of it but leaving space for her to share as much or as little as she felt comfortable with. "Motorcycle accident 3 years ago," Sarah explained. "A drunk driver ran a red light and hit me. I was lucky in a lot of ways, could have been much worse, but I lost my leg below the knee. During my recovery and rehabilitation, I spent a lot of time at the library because it was one of the few places I could get to independently while I was learning to use my prosthetic. I noticed all sorts of accessibility issues that the staff had never considered because they hadn't affected anyone on their radar before." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And you decided to become part of the solution rather than just pointing out the problems." "Exactly," Sarah said, pleased that he had understood her motivation so clearly. "I already had a master's degree in library science, and I discovered that I had both the technical knowledge and the personal experience to make a real difference. It's satisfying work, knowing that I'm helping remove barriers for other people." "That's impressive," Marcus said, and Sarah could tell that his respect was genuine rather than patronizing. "It takes courage to turn a difficult personal experience into an opportunity to help others. Not everyone is able to do that." As they continued through the storm, Sarah found herself feeling increasingly comfortable with Marcus. There was something about his combination of competence and humility that she found appealing. He was clearly someone who was accustomed to high-stakes situations and complex problems, yet he treated her disability matter-of-factly without either ignoring it or making it the focus of every interaction. It was a balance that few people managed to achieve. "We're getting close to your apartment complex," Marcus announced, checking his GPS. "Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what we're going to find when we get there. The snow is deep enough now that some parking areas might be completely inaccessible." Sarah felt a familiar twist of anxiety in her stomach. One of the ongoing challenges of her disability was that situations that were merely inconvenient for most people could become genuinely problematic for her. If the parking lot of her apartment complex was impassable, she might not be able to get from Marcus's truck to her building, even with his help. "The complex usually does a pretty good job with snow removal," she said, trying to sound more optimistic than she felt. "And my apartment is on the ground floor, so at least I won't have to deal with stairs once I get inside the building." "We'll figure it out," Marcus assured her. "Worst case scenario, I can carry you piggyback through the snow while you hold onto your crutches. It wouldn't be the strangest thing I've done in my career." Sarah laughed despite her anxiety. "I appreciate the offer, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. I'm not sure my dignity could survive being carried piggyback by a Navy SEAL." "Your dignity would be intact," Marcus said seriously. "Sometimes accepting help is the most dignified thing you can do. It shows that you're secure enough to prioritize practical solutions over pride." There was something profound in his observation that made Sarah pause. She had spent a lot of time since her accident learning to balance independence with acceptance of help when it was truly needed. It was an ongoing process, and she was still figuring out where those lines should be drawn. Marcus's perspective suggested that he understood the complexity of that balance in a way that many people didn't. As they rounded the final corner toward her apartment complex, both Sarah and Marcus could see that the situation was going to be challenging, but not impossible. The parking lot had been plowed at some point during the day, but that was now several hours ago, and there was significant snow accumulation throughout the area. However, the main walkway to the buildings appeared to be clear enough to navigate with careful planning. "I can get us reasonably close to your building," Marcus said, studying the layout of the complex. And it looks like the walkways are designed with accessibility in mind, so they should be manageable even with some snow coverage. This is actually a pretty good outcome, Sarah said, feeling relieved. I was worried we might have to attempt some kind of epic trek across an impassable wasteland. Marcus chuckled as he carefully positioned the truck in the spot that would require the least difficult navigation to reach the building entrance. Epic treks across wastelands are definitely within my skill set, but I'm glad this one is more straightforward. Sometimes the best operations are the ones that go according to plan. As Marcus helped Sarah navigate the snowy walkway to her apartment building, what neither of them realized was that their evening together was about to take a dramatic turn. They had successfully made it to her front door, and Sarah was fumbling in her purse for her keys when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The door to her apartment was slightly ajar. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice tight with sudden fear. "I never leave my door unlocked. Someone has been in my apartment." Marcus immediately shifted into a different mode of alertness. His casual, helpful demeanor remained, but Sarah could sense a new level of intensity in his focus. "Are you absolutely certain you locked it when you left this morning?" he asked, his voice calm but his eyes already scanning the hallway and the partially open door. "Positive," Sarah replied. "I always double-check because of the security deposit requirements, and I definitely wouldn't have left it open even a crack like that." Marcus gently moved Sarah to a position behind him, placing himself between her and the apartment door. "Do you have somewhere else you can stay tonight? A friend or family member nearby?" "My sister lives in Seattle, and my parents are about 40 minutes away, but in this weather." Sarah's voice trailed off as the reality of her situation began to sink in. "Why would someone break into my apartment? I don't have anything valuable, and everyone in the building knows I'm just a librarian." "Sometimes break-ins are random," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was considering other possibilities as well. "But right now, our priority is making sure you're safe. I'm going to check the apartment first, and then we can figure out what comes next." "You don't have to do that," Sarah protested, though she felt a tremendous sense of relief that Marcus was willing to take charge of the situation. "This isn't your responsibility." "Sarah," Marcus said, turning to look at her directly, "I told you earlier that I don't leave people behind. That doesn't just apply to transportation in snowstorms. If someone has violated your home, then you're dealing with a potential safety threat, and I'm not walking away from that." Marcus approached the apartment door with a level of caution that made Sarah realize just how seriously he was taking the situation. He moved quietly, listening carefully at the door before gently pushing it open further. The apartment was dark inside, which could mean that whoever had been there was gone, but it could also mean they were still there and trying to avoid detection. "Stay here in the hallway," Marcus instructed. "If I call for you, come in. If you hear anything that sounds like trouble, go to a neighbor's apartment and call the police. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, though her heart was pounding with anxiety about what Marcus might find inside her home. She watched as he disappeared into the darkness of her apartment, moving with the kind of silent precision that spoke to years of training in potentially dangerous environments. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Sarah could hear Marcus moving through her apartment systematically, checking each room with thoroughness that was both reassuring and terrifying. What if someone was still in there? What if Marcus was putting himself in danger for her sake? She found herself straining to hear any sounds that might indicate trouble, while simultaneously hoping that the silence meant everything was okay. "Sarah, you can come in now," Marcus finally called. "The apartment is clear, but you need to see this." Sarah made her way carefully into her apartment, using her crutches to navigate around the threshold. Marcus had turned on the lights, and what she saw made her gasp in shock and confusion. Her apartment hadn't been ransacked in the typical way she would have expected from a burglary. Instead, it looked like someone had been living there. The kitchen showed signs of recent use: dishes in the sink that weren't hers, food items on the counter that she hadn't purchased. The living room had been rearranged slightly, with the couch positioned differently and a blanket folded on the coffee table that she didn't recognize. Most disturbing of all, there were personal items scattered around that clearly didn't belong to her. A man's jacket hung over one of her chairs, toiletries in the bathroom that weren't hers, and what appeared to be someone's medication on her nightstand. "It looks like someone has been staying here," Marcus observed, his voice carefully neutral. The question is whether there's someone you know or a complete stranger who somehow gained access to your apartment. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The idea that someone had been living in her space, using her belongings, sleeping in her bed, was deeply violating in a way that a simple burglary wouldn't have been. "I have no idea who this could be," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't have any relatives or friends who have keys to my apartment, and I haven't given anyone permission to stay here." Marcus was examining the items more closely, looking for any clues about the identity of the unauthorized occupant. "The medication here is prescribed to someone named David Chen," he reported. "Does that name mean anything to you?" "Nothing," Sarah replied. "I've never heard that name before in my life." Marcus continued his examination of the evidence, approaching it with the same systematic thoroughness he had shown throughout the evening. "The food items are all recent. Nothing here is more than a few days old. The toiletries are mid-range brands, nothing particularly expensive or cheap. The jacket looks like it's from a department store, probably bought within the last year or two. This doesn't look like someone who's homeless or desperate. It's more like someone who was staying here temporarily for convenience." "But how would someone get access to my apartment?" Sarah asked. "The building has security measures, and my door was definitely locked when I left this morning." "There are several possibilities," Marcus said thoughtfully. "Someone could have obtained a key through the building management, either legitimately or through deception. They could have picked the lock, though that would require some skill, or they could have had help from someone who does have legitimate access, another tenant, a maintenance worker, someone like that." As Marcus spoke, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment, heavy footsteps that seemed to be approaching her door. Marcus heard them too, and immediately moved to a position where he could see the doorway while remaining partially concealed behind the wall. The footsteps stopped directly outside Sarah's apartment, and they could hear the sound of keys jingling. Someone was trying to unlock the door from the outside. Marcus motioned for Sarah to move to the far side of the living room, out of sight from the entrance. His demeanor had shifted into something that was clearly influenced by his military training, alert, ready, but not panicked. Sarah realized that while she was terrified by the situation, Marcus was actually in his element dealing with potential threats and uncertain circumstances. The door opened, and a man in his 30s walked in, clearly expecting the apartment to be empty. He was of medium height and build, with dark hair and the kind of generic appearance that would make him easily forgettable in a crowd. He was carrying a bag of what appeared to be takeout food and seemed completely comfortable in the space, as if he belonged there. The man made it 3 steps into the apartment before he noticed Marcus standing in the living room. "Who the hell are you?" the intruder demanded, though his tone suggested more surprise than aggression. "What are you doing in my apartment?" "Your apartment," Marcus replied calmly. "That's interesting because the lease here belongs to Sarah Martinez, and she's never seen you before in her life." The man's eyes flicked around the room and landed on Sarah, who was standing near the window with her crutches, clearly frightened but trying to maintain her composure. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running," he said, his voice taking on a more belligerent tone, "but I've been staying here for the past week, and I have permission from the building management." "Permission from building management?" Sarah found her voice, though it was shaking with a combination of fear and anger. "I'm the legal tenant here. Nobody from building management has the authority to give you permission to stay in my apartment without my consent." The man, who Sarah now assumed was David Chen based on the medication Marcus had found, seemed to realize that his situation was becoming complicated. "Look, there's obviously been some kind of misunderstanding," he said, setting down his bag of food and raising his hands in a gesture that was probably meant to appear non-threatening. "I can explain everything." "I'd like to hear that explanation," Marcus said, his tone remaining calm but carrying an undertone of authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. "Starting with how you obtained access to this apartment and why you think you have the right to be here." David glanced between Marcus and Sarah, clearly trying to assess his options. Sarah could see him taking in Marcus's obvious fitness and military bearing, and she could almost see him calculating whether attempting to leave or becoming confrontational were viable strategies. "I paid the building superintendent $500 to let me use this place for a couple of weeks," David said finally. "He told me the tenant was out of town and wouldn't be back until after the new year. I needed a place to stay while I was in town for work, and hotels are expensive for extended stays." Sarah felt her anger flaring. The building superintendent has no authority to make that kind of arrangement, and even if he did, I've been living here the entire time. I went to work every day this week. How could you possibly think I was out of town? I work during the day too, David said defensively. I'm usually gone from 7 in the morning until 6 or 7 at night. I just assumed we had different schedules and never crossed paths. Marcus stepped forward slightly, and Sarah could see that his patience with the situation was beginning to wear thin. So you're telling us that you've been sleeping in this woman's bed, using her bathroom, eating food in her kitchen, and living in her space for a week without her knowledge or permission, and you thought that was okay because you paid someone who doesn't have the authority to make that arrangement. I didn't know, David protested. The super said it was his apartment to rent out. He showed me around, gave me a key, told me the whole story about the tenant being out of town. How was I supposed to know he was lying? Sarah looked around her apartment with new eyes, realizing that David's presence explained several things that had been nagging at her over the past week. Her food had been disappearing faster than usual. Items had been moved around in ways that she had attributed to her own forgetfulness. Her bed had sometimes felt like it had been slept in differently than she remembered leaving it. She had dismissed all of these observations as stress or distraction from work, but now she realized that someone had literally been sharing her living space without her knowledge. "This is completely unacceptable," she said, her voice growing stronger as her shock began to transform into anger. "You've been violating my privacy and my security for a week. You've been sleeping in my bed, using my belongings, making yourself at home in my space. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" David had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable. "Look, I'm sorry. I really didn't know. If I had realized that you were actually living here, I never would have agreed to the arrangement. I thought I was renting an empty apartment from someone who had the authority to rent it." Marcus was studying David carefully, clearly trying to assess whether his story was credible and whether he represented any ongoing threat. "What's your full name, and what kind of work brings you to Minneapolis?" "David Chen. I'm a software consultant, and I've been working on a project for a client here in the Twin Cities. It was supposed to be a 2-week engagement, but it got extended, and I needed affordable accommodation." "Do you have any identification that confirms that?" Marcus asked. David reached carefully into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a driver's license and what appeared to be a business card. Marcus examined both items while keeping himself positioned between David and Sarah. "The ID matches the name on the medication we found," Marcus confirmed. "And the business card appears legitimate. David, I need you to gather your belongings and leave this apartment immediately. Sarah, do you want me to call the police about this situation?" Sarah considered the question carefully. On one hand, what David had done was clearly illegal. He had been trespassing and essentially squatting in her apartment. On the other hand, his story about being deceived by the building superintendent was at least plausible, and she could see that he seemed genuinely shocked to learn that he had been sharing the space with an unknowing tenant. "I want him out of my apartment right now," Sarah said firmly. "And I want to know exactly how this happened so it can't happen again. But I'm not sure calling the police tonight in this storm is going to accomplish much beyond making everything more complicated." "That's very generous of you," David said, moving quickly to gather his belongings. "I really am sorry about this situation. I'll be out of here in 5 minutes, and I'll deal with the building superintendent about getting my money back." As David hastily packed his few possessions, Marcus was taking photos of the items David was removing, clearly documenting the evidence of his unauthorized stay. Sarah appreciated his thoroughness. Even if she chose not to pursue legal action immediately, having a record of what had happened might be important later. "David," Marcus said as the man prepared to leave, "I need you to understand something. Sarah is going to be living here alone, and if she sees you anywhere near this building or this apartment again, she's going to call the police immediately. The weather doesn't give you an excuse to violate someone's home, and neither does a misunderstanding with building management." "I understand completely," David replied, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "I never want to see this place again. This whole situation has been a nightmare." After David left, Marcus immediately went to work securing the apartment. He checked all the windows to make sure they were locked, examined the door lock to see if it showed any signs of tampering, and helped Sarah move a heavy dresser in front of the door as an additional security measure. "You can't stay here alone tonight," Marcus said as he finished his security preparations. Not just because of David, he seems genuinely sorry and probably isn't a threat, but because this whole situation shows that your building's security has been compromised. If the superintendent is renting out occupied apartments to random people, there's no telling what other unsafe situations might arise. Sarah sank down onto her couch, feeling emotionally exhausted by the evening's events. What had started as a simple need for a ride home had evolved into a complex situation involving breaking and entering, unauthorized occupancy, and questions about the integrity of her building's management. She felt violated and vulnerable in a way that was difficult to process. "I don't really have anywhere else to go tonight," she said quietly. "My parents live too far away to reach safely in this storm, and I don't have any close friends in the immediate area who could take me in on short notice." Marcus sat down on the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You could stay at my hotel room," he offered. "I know that might sound inappropriate given that we just met, but it's a suite with a separate sitting area where you could sleep comfortably. And given everything that's happened tonight, I think safety should be the top priority." Sarah looked at Marcus carefully, trying to assess his offer. Everything about his behavior throughout the evening had suggested that he was trustworthy and genuinely concerned for her well-being. He had gone far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from a good Samaritan, and his military background provided some assurance that he was accustomed to maintaining appropriate boundaries even in unusual circumstances. "That's very kind of you," she said slowly. "But are you sure? This whole evening has been far more complicated than either of us expected when you offered me a ride home." "I'm sure," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Besides, tomorrow we can deal with the building management situation and make sure your apartment is properly secured before you come back. Sometimes these kinds of problems are easier to solve when you're not under immediate pressure to figure out where you're going to sleep." The hotel where Marcus was staying turned out to be a mid-range business establishment that catered primarily to corporate travelers and military personnel on temporary assignments. As they made their way through the lobby, Sarah noticed that despite the late hour and severe weather conditions, the hotel was bustling with activity. Other stranded travelers had apparently had the same idea of seeking shelter for the night, and the staff was working efficiently to accommodate the influx of unexpected guests. Marcus approached the front desk with Sarah beside him, and she could see the desk clerk's eyes widen slightly as he took in their snow-covered appearance and her obvious mobility equipment. "Mr. Thompson," the clerk said with professional courtesy, "I wasn't expecting you back this evening. I hope you weren't caught in the storm." "We were, actually," Marcus replied calmly. "Is it possible to get some additional blankets and pillows sent up to my suite? I have a guest who will be staying overnight due to the weather emergency." The desk clerk nodded without any sign of judgment or curiosity about the unusual circumstances. "Of course, sir. We've been getting quite a few requests for emergency accommodations tonight. I'll have housekeeping bring up extra bedding within the next few minutes." As they waited for the elevator, Sarah found herself reflecting on how the evening had unfolded. 6 hours earlier, she had been a single woman waiting for a bus home from work. Now she was staying overnight in a hotel with a Navy SEAL she had just met, after discovering that her apartment had been illegally occupied by a stranger for the past week. It was the kind of story that would have sounded completely implausible if someone had told it to her secondhand. "Are you doing okay?" Marcus asked as they rode the elevator up to his floor. "I know this has been an overwhelming evening, and you've handled everything remarkably well." "I'm still processing it all," Sarah admitted. "A few hours ago, my biggest worry was missing my bus. Now I'm dealing with identity theft, illegal trespassing, compromised building security, and spending the night with someone I just met. It's a lot to take in." Marcus's suite was spacious and well-appointed, with a separate sitting area that included a comfortable sleeper sofa. Sarah could see that he had been staying there for a while. His belongings were neatly organized, and there were work documents spread across the desk that suggested he was indeed engaged in some kind of consulting project. Everything about the space reinforced her impression that Marcus was organized, professional, and accustomed to maintaining high standards even in temporary accommodations. "The bathroom is fully accessible," Marcus pointed out, showing Sarah the grab bars and shower seat that the hotel provided for guests with mobility needs. "And if you need anything adjusted or moved around to make it more comfortable, just let me know." As Sarah settled into the sitting area, she realized that despite the unusual circumstances, she felt safer than she had in weeks. The revelation that someone had been secretly sharing her apartment had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The idea that her home, the place where she was supposed to feel most secure and protected, had been violated in such a fundamental way was deeply disturbing. Having Marcus nearby, with his obvious competence and protective instincts, provided a sense of security that she hadn't realized she needed. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said as Marcus prepared coffee for both of them using the suite's kitchenette facilities. "Of course. Why have you been so willing to help me tonight? I mean, offering a ride home was already generous, but everything since then has gone far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from a stranger." Marcus considered the question carefully while he worked. "There are probably several answers to that," he said finally. "Part of it is training. When you've spent years in situations where people depend on each other for survival, you develop habits of thinking about group welfare rather than just individual convenience. Part of it is probably that I recognize competence and resilience when I see it, and you've demonstrated both of those qualities tonight." He handed her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "But honestly, part of it is probably that I like you. You're intelligent, you handle stress well, you care about other people, like the way you were concerned about Mr. Peterson even though you had your own problems to worry about. Those are qualities I respect, and when I encounter people like that, I want to help them succeed." Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "That's probably the nicest compliment anyone has given me in a long time, especially considering that you've seen me at my most vulnerable, stranded in a snowstorm, dealing with a home invasion, completely dependent on help from a stranger." "I don't think you're as vulnerable as you think you are," Marcus observed. "You've been making good decisions all evening under difficult circumstances. You trusted your instincts about accepting help when you needed it. You stood up for yourself when you discovered someone had violated your home. You've been practical about accepting assistance while maintaining your dignity and independence. Those aren't the behaviors of someone who's vulnerable. They're the behaviors of someone who knows how to handle adversity." As they talked, Sarah found herself becoming more and more impressed with Marcus's character. He had a way of analyzing situations that was both systematic and compassionate, and his perspectives on challenges and problem-solving reflected both his military training and a genuine thoughtfulness about human nature. She was beginning to understand why he had been successful in his military career, and why organizations were interested in hearing him as a consultant. "What's your assessment of the situation with my apartment?" Sarah asked. "Do you think this David person is likely to cause any more problems, or do you think the bigger issue is with the building management?" "I think David is probably exactly what he claimed to be, someone who got caught up in a situation that spiraled beyond his understanding," Marcus replied. His reactions seemed genuine, and he was clearly uncomfortable once he realized what had actually been happening. "I doubt you'll have any more trouble from him personally." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "The building management situation is more concerning. If your superintendent is willing to rent out occupied apartments to strangers for cash, that suggests either serious corruption or serious incompetence. Either way, it represents an ongoing security risk that needs to be addressed systematically. What do you think I should do about it? Tomorrow, after the storm passes, I think you should document everything that happened and report it both to the building's main management company and to local authorities. You should also consider consulting with a lawyer about your rights as a tenant and what remedies might be available to you. This isn't just about getting David's presence resolved. It's about making sure the underlying security breach gets fixed." Marcus's advice made sense, and Sarah appreciated that he was thinking about long-term solutions rather than just immediate fixes. "Would you be willing to help me with that process? I mean, I know you have your own work and responsibilities, but I have a feeling I'm going to need someone who understands how to deal with authority figures and bureaucratic systems." "Absolutely," Marcus replied without hesitation. "In fact, I'd like to be there when you confront the building's superintendent. People like that often try to intimidate tenants who complain about problems, and having a witness with a military background might encourage him to take your concerns more seriously." As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself enjoying Marcus's company in a way that surprised her. Despite the stressful circumstances that had brought them together, she discovered that he was easy to talk to, intellectually curious, and surprisingly funny when he allowed his professional demeanor to relax slightly. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, and seemed genuinely interested in the challenges of making public services accessible to people with disabilities. "Have you always lived in Minnesota?" Marcus asked during a lull in their conversation about library accessibility programs. "Born and raised here," Sarah replied. "I went away for college and graduate school, but I came back because I wanted to be close to my family and because I believe in the importance of investing in your home community. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to live somewhere with a warmer climate, but Minnesota has a lot of good qualities that people from other places don't always appreciate. Such as, people here generally believe in taking care of each other. There's a strong sense of community responsibility, and when crisis hits, Minnesotans tend to step up and help their neighbors. There's also a culture of civic engagement. People here vote. They serve on boards and committees. They volunteer for causes they believe in. It's not perfect, but there's a genuine commitment to making society work for everyone." Marcus nodded with apparent approval. "Those are exactly the qualities that have impressed me during my time here. I've been in a lot of different places around the world, and I've learned to recognize communities that have their priorities in order. Minnesota seems like a place where I could build the kind of life I'm looking for." "What kind of life is that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him weighing how much personal information he wanted to share. "I want to be part of a community where I can contribute something meaningful, where I can use my skills to help solve real problems for real people. I want to be able to put down roots, maybe eventually have a family, without constantly wondering when I'm going to have to pack up and move to the next assignment." "That sounds like a reasonable goal for someone with your background and experience." "It feels reasonable to me too, but it's also a big change from the life I've been living for the past 12 years. Military culture is very focused on mission accomplishment and unit cohesion, but civilian culture is more about individual relationships and long-term planning. I'm still figuring out how to navigate that transition." Sarah could hear the uncertainty in Marcus's voice, and she realized that despite his obvious competence and confidence, he was facing his own challenges and transitions. "You seem like you're adapting well," she said. "Your instincts about how to help people and solve problems are definitely transferring to civilian situations." "Thanks for saying that. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether I'm being helpful or just overly controlling because I'm used to military command structures. From my perspective, you've struck exactly the right balance. You've taken charge when leadership was needed, but you've also respected my autonomy and included me in decision-making. That's not easy to do, especially in stressful situations." As they continued talking, Sarah found herself becoming aware of an attraction to Marcus that went beyond gratitude for his help. There was something appealing about his combination of strength and gentleness, his analytical intelligence paired with genuine empathy for other people. She also couldn't help noticing that he was quite good-looking, with the kind of fitness and bearing that came from years of demanding physical training. At the same time, she was acutely aware that their relationship had developed under highly unusual circumstances. Would she feel the same way about Marcus if they had met at a coffee shop or through mutual friends? Was her attraction influenced by the stress of the evening and her relief at having someone competent take care of her safety? These were questions she couldn't answer immediately, but they were definitely worth considering as she thought about what might happen after the storm passed. "I should probably let you get some rest," Marcus said eventually, glancing at the clock and seeing that it was well past midnight. "Tomorrow is going to be a busy day, dealing with your apartment situation and probably helping other people dig out from this storm." "You're probably right," Sarah agreed, though she found herself reluctant to end their conversation. "Thank you again for everything you've done tonight. I know I keep saying that, but I really want you to understand how much it means to me." "You don't need to keep thanking me," Marcus said with a smile. "Tonight has been interesting and meaningful for me too. It's given me a chance to use my skills in a way that directly helps people in my potential new community. That feels good." As Marcus prepared the sleeper sofa for Sarah and gathered extra blankets and pillows, she watched him work with the same systematic efficiency he had shown throughout the evening. Even this simple task was approached with attention to detail and genuine care for her comfort. She was beginning to realize that Marcus's helpful nature wasn't just a response to emergency circumstances. It seemed to be a fundamental aspect of his character. "Will you be comfortable?" Marcus asked as he finished preparing her sleeping area. "This is perfect," Sarah assured him. "Much more comfortable than I expected when I was standing at that bus stop this afternoon." It's funny how life works sometimes, Marcus observed. If the bus had come on time, we never would have met. If the storm hadn't been as bad as it was, we might not have had the time to really get to know each other. If your apartment hadn't been compromised, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to work together solving a complex problem. Are you saying you think everything that happened tonight was meant to happen? I don't know about meant to happen, but I do think some good things have come out of what started as a series of problems. We helped Mr. Peterson get home safely. We resolved your apartment situation without anyone getting hurt. We discovered and addressed a serious security issue that could have affected other tenants. And we got to meet each other under circumstances that really showed our character. Sarah smiled as she settled into her makeshift bed. When you put it that way, it does sound like the evening was more successful than disastrous. That's exactly how I see it, Marcus said. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from the most challenging circumstances. The key is being willing to adapt and work together when unexpected situations arise. As Marcus turned off the lights and headed toward his bedroom, Sarah lay awake thinking about the events of the day and what they might mean for her future. She had started the morning as a single woman with a routine life, dealing with the normal challenges of her disability, but generally managing her independence successfully. She was ending the day having met someone who might become important in her life, having discovered and resolved a serious threat to her security, and having demonstrated to herself that she could handle complex emergencies with grace and good judgment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she dealt with the aftermath of the evening's discoveries, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt optimistic about her ability to handle whatever came next. And for the first time since her accident, she was genuinely excited about the possibility of getting to know someone better and seeing where that relationship might lead. The next morning brought crystal-clear skies and the kind of pristine winter landscape that made Minnesota's harsh weather seem almost worth enduring. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Marcus on the phone, apparently coordinating some kind of assistance effort for people affected by the storm. Through the suite's large windows, she could see that the snow had finally stopped, leaving behind over 18 inches of accumulation that had transformed the city into a winter wonderland. "Good morning," Marcus said as he finished his call. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected, actually," Sarah replied, surprised by how rested she felt. "That sleeper sofa is more comfortable than my own bed. How long have you been awake?" "About an hour. I've been coordinating with some local emergency services to help with storm recovery efforts. Apparently, several elderly residents in various apartment complexes lost power overnight, and they're organizing wellness checks and temporary relocation assistance. I volunteered to help with transportation since my vehicle can handle the snow conditions." Sarah felt a familiar sense of admiration for Marcus's instinctive desire to help others, even when he had his own concerns to manage. That's exactly the kind of community involvement you were talking about last night. You're already becoming the kind of citizen that makes Minnesota communities strong. "It feels good to be useful," Marcus said with a smile. "But first, we need to deal with your apartment situation. I called the main management office for your building this morning, and they're sending a regional supervisor over at 10 o'clock to meet with us. I also documented everything from last night and created a file that you can share with them or with legal counsel if that becomes necessary." Sarah was impressed by Marcus's proactive approach to problem solving. "You've been busy this morning. Did you get any sleep at all?" "Enough," Marcus replied. "In the military, you learn to function effectively on limited sleep when there are important tasks to accomplish. Today feels like one of those days." As they prepared to return to Sarah's apartment complex, she found herself feeling nervous about the confrontation that was likely to occur with the building's superintendent. She had never been comfortable with conflict, preferring to solve problems through conversation and compromise rather than direct confrontation. But the violation of her home and security was serious enough that it required a firm response, and she was grateful to have Marcus's support and expertise as she navigated the situation. The drive back to Sarah's apartment complex revealed the full extent of the previous night's storm. Emergency crews were working throughout the city to clear major roads and restore power to areas that had lost service. Many businesses remained closed, and the few people who were out were moving slowly and carefully through the deep snow. Sarah realized that without Marcus's help, she would have been completely stranded and possibly in genuine danger during the height of the storm. "There's the building supervisor," Marcus pointed out as they arrived at the apartment complex. A thin man in his 50s was standing near the building entrance, smoking a cigarette and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Sarah recognized him as Jim Kowalski, the superintendent who had always seemed competent and trustworthy in their previous interactions. The regional supervisor from the management company turned out to be a professional woman in her 40s named Linda Chen, who approached the situation with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested she had dealt with similar problems before. Sarah couldn't help noticing that her last name was the same as David's, though they appeared to have no relationship beyond that coincidence. "Ms. Martinez, I want to apologize on behalf of our company for what happened to you," Linda said as they gathered in the building's main office. "The situation you've described is completely unacceptable, and we're going to take immediate steps to address it and prevent it from happening again." Jim Kowalski was shifting uncomfortably and avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. "I can explain everything," he said finally. "David Chen told me he was Ms. Martinez's boyfriend, and that she had asked him to arrange temporary accommodation while she was out of town visiting family. He showed me text messages that appeared to be from her, confirming the arrangement." "Text messages," Sarah said with disbelief. "I've never communicated with David Chen in my life, and I definitely didn't authorize anyone to use my apartment." Marcus leaned forward with interest. "Mr. Kowalski, do you still have copies of those text messages? Because if David was impersonating Sarah to gain unauthorized access to her apartment, that's identity fraud in addition to trespassing." Jim pulled out an older model smartphone and scrolled through his messages, finding the conversation he was referring to. As he showed the phone to Linda and Marcus, Sarah could see their expressions becoming increasingly serious. "These messages are definitely fraudulent," Linda said, after examining the phone carefully. "The phone number doesn't match our records for Ms. Martinez, and the language doesn't sound like authentic communication from a tenant to building management. This appears to be a carefully planned deception." Marcus was taking photos of the fraudulent messages with his own phone. "David Chen represented himself to us last night as someone who had been deceived by building management, but this evidence suggests he was actively engaged in fraud to gain access to Sarah's apartment. This changes the situation significantly." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications of what they were discovering. David hadn't been an innocent victim of miscommunication. He had actively impersonated her to gain unauthorized access to her home. The violation felt even more serious now that she understood it had been premeditated rather than accidental. "We need to call the police immediately," Linda said, reaching for her phone. "This isn't just a building management issue anymore. This is criminal activity that needs to be reported to law enforcement." As Linda made the call to report the fraud, Marcus was working with Jim to gather additional information about David's interactions with building management. It emerged that David had been very persuasive and had provided what appeared to be legitimate documentation supporting his story about being Sarah's boyfriend. He had also paid the superintendent $500 in cash, which had helped convince Jim that the arrangement was legitimate. "I feel terrible about this," Jim said, looking genuinely distressed. "I thought I was helping a tenant accommodate her boyfriend during a difficult family situation. I never imagined that someone would go to such lengths to gain unauthorized access to an apartment. The important thing now is that we've identified the problem, and we can take steps to prevent it from happening again," Marcus said constructively. "But Sarah, I think you need to consider the possibility that David's interest in your apartment might not have been random. The level of planning involved in this fraud suggests he might have specifically targeted you for some reason." This thought had not occurred to Sarah, and it added a new dimension of concern to an already disturbing situation. "What kind of reason would someone have for specifically targeting my apartment?" "Several possibilities," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "He might have been interested in your personal information for identity theft purposes. He might have been monitoring your routine for reasons we don't understand. He might have been using your apartment as a base for other criminal activities in the area. Without understanding his true motivations, it's hard to know what level of ongoing risk you might face." When the police arrived, they took statements from everyone involved and began their own investigation into David's activities. The detective assigned to the case was a middle-aged woman named Officer Rodriguez, who seemed experienced in dealing with fraud and trespassing cases. We're going to need to dust for fingerprints in your apartment, Ms. Martinez, Officer Rodriguez explained. And we'll want to examine any personal items that Mr. Chen might have access to determine if there's evidence of identity theft or other criminal activity. The fingerprinting process took most of the morning, and Sarah found herself feeling violated all over again as she realized how thoroughly David had made himself at home in her space. Evidence suggested that he had used her computer, accessed her mail, and even worn some of her clothing. The level of intrusion was far beyond what she had initially understood. We found evidence that he accessed your online accounts, Officer Rodriguez reported after examining Sarah's computer. He logged into your email, your online banking, and several social media accounts. We're going to need you to change all of your passwords immediately and monitor your accounts for any unauthorized activity. Marcus was taking careful notes of everything the police discovered, and Sarah could see him developing what appeared to be a comprehensive security plan for addressing the aftermath of David's intrusion. Sarah, we're also going to need to check your credit reports and put fraud alerts on all of your accounts. Someone with access to your personal information and online accounts could potentially cause significant financial damage if we don't take preventive measures immediately. As the day progressed, what had started as a simple apartment break-in was revealing itself to be a complex case of identity fraud with potentially far-reaching consequences. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of the problem and grateful beyond words that Marcus was there to help her navigate the bureaucratic and legal complexities involved. "I can't believe how much damage one person can cause in just a week," Sarah said as they worked through the process of securing her accounts and documenting the extent of David's unauthorized access. "It's actually impressive in a disturbing way," Marcus observed. "This level of systematic intrusion requires planning, patience, and technical knowledge. David isn't just someone who stumbled into your apartment. He's someone who targeted you specifically and executed a well-planned invasion of your privacy and security." By afternoon, the police investigation had expanded to include federal authorities because of the interstate nature of David's activities. It emerged that he had used similar tactics to gain unauthorized access to apartments in several other cities, always targeting